History doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes, and nowhere is this more evident than in the recurring patterns of political behavior that span generations. After decades of observing the great political convulsions of the 20th century, from the rise of totalitarian movements to the ideological battles of the Cold War, I've come to recognize something profound: the same fundamental human drives, fears, and delusions that shaped politics in 1930s Europe continue to manifest today, albeit in new forms. The specific circumstances change, the technology evolves, the names and faces are different, but the underlying dynamics remain remarkably consistent. This isn't fatalism, it's empirical observation. Understanding these patterns doesn't doom us to repeat them, rather, it provides us with the intellectual tools necessary to recognize dangerous trends before they metastasize into existential threats. Today, as American democracy faces its own moment of testing, these historical patterns offer both warning and guidance for those willing to see beyond the immediate noise of daily politics to the deeper currents shaping our political future. Chapter 1: The Eternal Return of Political Messianism. The most dangerous pattern in modern politics is also the most seductive: the promise of total solutions to complex problems. I witnessed this phenomenon firsthand during the ideological fervor of mid-20th century Europe, where intellectual movements promised to solve all of humanity's problems through the application of supposedly scientific principles to social organization. Whether it was the communist promise of a classless society or the fascist dream of national regeneration, these movements shared a common characteristic: they offered certainty in an uncertain world, complete answers to partial questions, and final solutions to permanent problems. Today's American political landscape exhibits striking parallels to these historical patterns. The contemporary appeal of populist movements, both left and right, draws from the same psychological well that fed earlier totalitarian impulses. Citizens frustrated by the messy compromises of democratic governance are attracted to leaders who promise to cut through complexity with simple, decisive action. The rhetoric may be different, talk of draining the swamp or fundamental transformation, but the underlying appeal is identical: the fantasy that political problems have definitive solutions if only we have the will to implement them. This messianic impulse reveals itself in several key ways that transcend particular ideological orientations. First, there's the promise of returning to an imagined golden age, whether it's "Make America Great Again" or progressive visions of recapturing some lost moment of social solidarity. Second, there's the identification of specific groups as obstacles to this restoration, whether they're the establishment, the 1%, or various ethnic and cultural minorities. Third, there's the demand for unconditional loyalty to the movement and its leader, with dissent characterized as betrayal or false consciousness. What makes these patterns particularly dangerous in the American context is how they interact with existing democratic institutions. Unlike the European societies where I observed the rise of totalitarian movements, America has strong constitutional safeguards and a long tradition of democratic governance. However, these very strengths can become vulnerabilities when messianic movements learn to work within the system while systematically undermining its pluralistic foundations. The challenge isn't just recognizing these patterns, it's understanding how they adapt to different institutional contexts while maintaining their essential character. Chapter 2: The Intellectual's Eternal Temptation. If there's one pattern that I've observed with particular clarity throughout my career, it's the recurring tendency of intellectuals to abandon critical thinking in favor of ideological certainty. This phenomenon fascinated and appalled me during the Cold War years, when I watched brilliant minds contort themselves to justify Stalin's crimes or dismiss obvious evidence of totalitarian brutality. The mechanism was always the same: the substitution of theoretical elegance for empirical observation, the preference for systematic explanations over messy realities. Today's American intellectual landscape demonstrates how this pattern persists across different political contexts. Whether it's progressive academics who cannot acknowledge the failures of their preferred policies or conservative intellectuals who bend scholarship to serve partisan ends, the underlying dynamic remains constant. The intellectual becomes captive to a worldview that must be defended at all costs, even when evidence suggests fundamental revisions are necessary. The digital age has accelerated this process in ways that would have been unimaginable during my era of print journalism and university seminars. Social media creates echo chambers that amplify ideological conformity, while the academic job market punishes intellectual independence in favor of theoretical orthodoxy. Young scholars learn quickly that certain questions cannot be asked, certain conclusions cannot be reached, regardless of where honest inquiry might lead. Consider how contemporary debates about inequality, immigration, or cultural change often proceed along predictable lines that seem predetermined by ideological position rather than shaped by evidence. Progressive intellectuals approach these issues with assumptions about systemic oppression and the need for transformative change, while conservative intellectuals begin with premises about traditional values and institutional stability. Rarely do we see genuine intellectual curiosity that follows evidence wherever it leads, even when it challenges preferred narratives. This pattern is particularly dangerous because intellectuals play a crucial role in shaping public discourse and policy formation. When they abandon their essential function, which is to ask difficult questions and challenge conventional wisdom, they become propagandists rather than truth seekers. The result is a degradation of democratic debate, as complex issues get reduced to competing orthodoxies rather than subjects for honest investigation. The historical parallel is striking. Just as European intellectuals in the 1930s and 1940s often provided sophisticated justifications for obviously destructive political movements, today's American intellectuals risk doing the same thing through different means. The stakes may be lower, but the pattern of intellectual corruption remains fundamentally similar. Chapter 3: The Recurring Crisis of Democratic Legitimacy. Democracy has always been fragile, but certain patterns of crisis recur with such regularity that they reveal fundamental tensions within democratic systems themselves. Throughout my observations of 20th century politics, I noticed that democratic legitimacy comes under pressure whenever significant groups of citizens begin to feel that the system no longer represents their interests or values. This isn't simply a matter of losing elections, it's a deeper sense that the entire framework of democratic governance has become illegitimate. The American experience today exhibits many characteristics that I observed during democratic crises in Europe. There's a growing sense among significant portions of the population that elections don't really matter because the real decisions are made by unelected bureaucrats, media elites, or global economic forces. Whether this perception focuses on the deep state, corporate oligarchy, or progressive institutions, the underlying dynamic is the same. Citizens feel that democratic procedures have become mere theater while actual power operates through other channels. This crisis of legitimacy creates a dangerous spiral. As faith in democratic institutions declines, citizens become more attracted to anti-system politicians who promise to restore real democracy by circumventing existing institutional constraints. These leaders gain support precisely because they're willing to break norms and challenge established procedures, but their success further undermines confidence in democratic governance. What's particularly striking about this pattern is how it transcends traditional left-right divisions. Progressive activists who view the Supreme Court as an illegitimate obstacle to social justice, conservative populists who see federal bureaucracy as an unconstitutional usurpation of local authority, and libertarians who regard most government activity as fundamentally coercive all share a common skepticism about existing democratic institutions. The historical precedent is sobering. European democracies in the interwar period faced similar legitimacy crises, often triggered by economic disruption and cultural change that existing institutions seemed unable to address effectively. Citizens who lost faith in democratic processes became susceptible to radical alternatives that promised more decisive action and clearer results. However, understanding this pattern also suggests potential remedies. Democratic legitimacy can be restored, but only through leaders who demonstrate genuine respect for institutional constraints while also showing that democratic processes can produce meaningful results for ordinary citizens. The key is finding ways to renew democratic practice without abandoning democratic principles, a delicate balance that requires both intellectual sophistication and political wisdom. Chapter 4: The Unintended Consequences of Ideological Purity. One of the most consistent patterns I've observed across different political contexts is how the pursuit of ideological purity inevitably produces results that contradict the original intentions. This isn't merely ironic, it's a fundamental characteristic of political action that transcends particular movements or historical periods. The French communists I knew in the 1940s genuinely believed they were creating a more just society, yet their methods consistently produced oppression and human suffering. Similarly, today's political movements often achieve outcomes directly opposed to their stated goals through an unwillingness to acknowledge complexity and accept compromise. Consider how contemporary American progressivism, despite its stated commitment to helping disadvantaged groups, often implements policies that harm the very people it claims to serve. Rent control laws intended to make housing affordable instead reduce the housing supply and create perverse incentives. Criminal justice reforms designed to address inequality sometimes result in increased crime that disproportionately affects minority communities. Educational policies meant to promote equity can actually reduce opportunities for talented students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Conservative movements exhibit parallel patterns. The desire to preserve traditional values leads to support for authoritarian leaders who actually undermine the institutional foundations that make traditional life possible. The commitment to free markets gets translated into crony capitalism that distorts economic competition. The defense of constitutional principles becomes a justification for undermining democratic norms when they produce inconvenient results. These patterns emerge because ideological thinking prioritizes theoretical consistency over practical outcomes. When reality conflicts with theory, the ideological response is to dismiss reality rather than revise theory. This creates a feedback loop where policies become increasingly disconnected from their effects, and supporters become increasingly isolated from contradictory evidence. The mechanism is always similar. Ideological movements develop elaborate explanations for why their failures are actually successes, or why apparent contradictions actually confirm their worldview. Progressive intellectuals explain away the failures of progressive policies by arguing that they weren't implemented purely enough, or that opposition sabotaged them. Conservative intellectuals similarly dismiss evidence that challenges their premises by claiming that external forces prevented proper implementation. Historical experience suggests that this pattern can only be broken through sustained engagement with empirical evidence and willingness to modify approaches based on results rather than intentions. This requires the kind of intellectual humility that ideological thinking systematically discourages, but it's essential for any political movement that hopes to achieve lasting positive change. Chapter 5: The Cyclical Nature of Political Polarization. Political polarization isn't a permanent condition, it's a cyclical phenomenon that waxes and wanes according to identifiable patterns. During my lifetime, I witnessed several cycles of polarization and reconciliation, from the ideological battles of the 1930s through the Cold War divisions to the gradual convergence of the 1990s. Each cycle followed a similar trajectory: growing disagreement about fundamental questions, institutional breakdown, crisis, and eventual recognition that extreme polarization threatens everyone's interests. America today is clearly in a hypolarization phase, with characteristics that mirror historical precedents in disturbing ways. Political opponents are increasingly viewed as existential enemies rather than fellow citizens with different opinions. Institutional norms that previously constrained political competition are being abandoned by both sides in pursuit of short-term advantage. Media and educational institutions are being captured by partisan perspectives, reducing the space for genuine dialogue and compromise. What makes this pattern particularly dangerous is how it becomes self-reinforcing. As polarization increases, moderate voices get marginalized and extreme positions become normalized. Citizens sort themselves into ideologically homogeneous communities, both geographic and virtual, where their views are constantly reinforced and opposing perspectives are demonized. Political entrepreneurs discover that inflammatory rhetoric generates more attention and support than nuanced analysis, creating incentives for further escalation. However, historical perspective also reveals grounds for cautious optimism. Previous cycles of extreme polarization in democratic societies have eventually broken down when the costs became too high for key actors to bear. The civil rights era saw bitter divisions that many thought were irreconcilable, yet American society eventually developed a new consensus around basic principles of equality. The Cold War created profound ideological divisions within Western societies, but these gradually diminished as the practical benefits of democratic cooperation became apparent. The key insight is that polarization cycles are influenced by both structural factors and conscious choices by political leaders. While underlying social and economic tensions create the conditions for polarization, the specific trajectory depends on whether influential figures choose to exploit divisions or work to bridge them. The pattern can be broken, but only through leadership that prioritizes long-term democratic stability over short-term political advantage. Understanding this cyclical pattern should encourage both patience and urgency. Patience because dramatic social change takes time. Urgency because the window for constructive action may be limited. The goal isn't to eliminate political disagreement, which is healthy and necessary in a diverse society, but to restore norms that allow disagreement to occur within a framework of mutual respect and shared democratic commitment. Chapter 6: International Dimensions of Domestic Political Patterns. One of the most important insights from comparative political analysis is how domestic political patterns are influenced by international context in ways that participants rarely recognize. During the Cold War, I observed how ideological divisions within Western societies were shaped by the broader global conflict between democratic and totalitarian systems. Citizens who might have disagreed amicably about domestic policies found themselves taking extreme positions because their debates were embedded in existential questions about civilization itself. Today's American political polarization exhibits similar international dimensions that are often overlooked in domestic analysis. The rise of authoritarian populism isn't unique to America. It's a global phenomenon that reflects common challenges facing democratic societies in the 21st century. From Brexit Britain to Bolsonaro's Brazil, from Modi's India to Orbán's Hungary, we see remarkably similar patterns of democratic stress emerging across different cultural and institutional contexts. These parallels suggest that American political problems aren't simply the result of domestic factors like economic inequality, cultural change, or media transformation. They're also responses to global trends that create similar pressures across democratic societies: increased migration, economic disruption from technological change, the erosion of traditional social hierarchies, and the challenge of maintaining national sovereignty in an interconnected world. Understanding these international dimensions is crucial for several reasons. First, it helps Americans recognize that their political challenges aren't unique or necessarily evidence of fundamental American decline. Other successful democracies are wrestling with similar issues, and their experiences offer valuable lessons about both what works and what doesn't. Second, it reveals how domestic political movements are often connected to transnational networks that share strategies, rhetoric, and sometimes financial resources. Consider how contemporary American populism draws inspiration and tactical approaches from similar movements in other countries. while progressive activism similarly operates through international networks that coordinate messaging and strategy. These connections mean that domestic political developments can't be understood in isolation from global trends, and solutions may require international cooperation rather than purely national responses. The European experience during the 20th century demonstrated both the dangers and opportunities created by these international dynamics. The spread of totalitarian movements in the 1930s was facilitated by transnational networks that shared ideology and tactics, but the eventual democratic recovery was also supported by international institutions that encouraged cooperation and peaceful competition. Today's challenges require similar recognition that democratic resilience depends partly on international solidarity among democratic societies. Chapter 7. Learning from history without being imprisoned by it. The ultimate lesson from studying recurring political patterns isn't fatalism but wisdom, the recognition that while history doesn't determine the future, understanding historical patterns can help us navigate present challenges more effectively. Throughout my career, I've tried to demonstrate how empirical study of political phenomena can inform better decision-making without falling into either naive optimism or paralyzing pessimism about human possibilities. The key is developing what I call informed skepticism, a stance that takes seriously both the constraints imposed by human nature and social structures, and the genuine possibilities for positive change through intelligent action. This requires rejecting both revolutionary fantasies about transforming human nature and conservative fatalism about the impossibility of meaningful reform. Instead, it means working within reality's constraints while remaining alert to opportunities for incremental improvement. Applied to contemporary American politics, this perspective suggests several practical principles for democratic citizenship. First, citizens should be deeply suspicious of any political movement that promises simple solutions to complex problems, regardless of whether it comes from left or right. Second, they should value institutional safeguards and procedural protections even when these constraints prevent their preferred policies from being implemented. Third, they should cultivate intellectual virtues, curiosity, humility, tolerance for ambiguity, that enable productive engagement across political differences. Most importantly, citizens should understand that democracy requires active maintenance rather than passive consumption. Democratic institutions don't preserve themselves automatically, they depend on citizens who understand their value and are willing to defend them against both external threats and internal corruption. This means participating in civic life not just during election seasons but as an ongoing responsibility of citizenship. Historical patterns suggest that democratic societies can navigate even severe challenges successfully, but only if enough citizens remain committed to democratic values and practices. The alternatives, whether authoritarian populism or technocratic governance that bypasses democratic input, may seem attractive during moments of crisis, but they inevitably produce worse outcomes for human freedom and flourishing. The goal isn't to predict the future based on historical patterns, but to use historical understanding to make better choices in the present. This requires combining intellectual analysis with practical wisdom, empirical observation with moral commitment, and realistic assessment of constraints with determination to work for improvement within those constraints. These are the essential tasks of democratic citizenship in any era, but they become especially urgent during periods of political stress and institutional challenge. Conclusion. History may rhyme, but it doesn't write itself, we do. The patterns I've identified across decades of political observation reveal both the constraints and possibilities that shape democratic life. While human nature and social dynamics create recurring challenges that no society can completely escape, conscious choice and intelligent action can influence how these patterns unfold. The American experiment in democratic self-governance faces genuine tests today, but understanding historical precedents provides hope rather than despair. Other democratic societies have navigated similar challenges and emerged stronger. The key is maintaining intellectual honesty about both the dangers we face and the resources available to address them. This requires citizens capable of learning from history without being paralyzed by it, who can recognize warning signs without succumbing to panic, and who remain committed to democratic values even when democratic processes produce disappointing results. The future remains unwritten, but it will be shaped by the choices we make today based on the wisdom we can glean from yesterday's experiences.